This is an incredible honor. My name's Keir Cutler. I'm here with my wife, Evelyn. We're from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And Mark Rylance is sitting in the front row. There's so many people. Alexander Waugh, I've never met, is here. I mean, just so many. The great Derek Jacobi, who you have incredible fans all over Canada. So I'd like to speak to you. I've been performing Is Shakespeare Dead for many, many years, a version of it. And I'd like to tell you how I came to learn of Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead. And this is from a play that I've been performing all summer in Canada, across the country. The title of the play is Shakespeare Crackpot. It's really the making of Is Shakespeare Dead. When William Shakespeare died, 400 years ago, this year, in the year 1616, it was strangely not an event. His death wasn't even an event in the little town of Stratford upon Avon, his home, where it was apparently raining. Now, the plays and poems were famous, yet apparently no one was interested in the man we associate with them by name. And as far as we can determine, no one thought to travel the 100-mile, 2-day journey from London to Stratford to pay their last respects. There were no lamenting poems, no eulogies, no national tears. 7 years passed. Then in the year 1623, the first folio of the plays attributed to William Shakespeare was published. And even then, no one's on record of traveling to Stratford to learn what could be learned about the man William Shakespeare. More years passed. Then in 1642, the Puritans finally succeeded in closing what they viewed as the sinful London theatres, where thieves, horse dealers, and whoremongers congregated, effectively ending the English Renaissance. Now, obviously, with all the theatres closed, no one was writing accounts of famous English playwrights. Theatres wouldn't reopen until 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy. Then, the year 1664 arrived. Does anyone know why that year's important? It's 100 years after the birth of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's centennial! And no one noticed. Isn't that incredible? 100 years after the birth of William Shakespeare, no festivities, no celebrations, no bardolatry. And even then, no one's on record yet of traveling from London to Stratford to learn what could be learned about the man William Shakespeare. More years passed. Then decades passed. Then gradually there was a reawakening to the brilliance that was in William Shakespeare's works. And finally, it occurred to someone to travel to Stratford to learn what could be learned about the man William Shakespeare. But by then, his wife, his children, his granddaughter, in fact, everyone had actually known the man was long since dead. And more importantly, nothing could be found to demonstrate there'd ever been a great writer in the town. Why? Why had no one thought to protect or preserve something? Just a handwritten line from a play or a poem would have been enough. But there was absolutely nothing indicative of artistic merit, and what little there was seemed to suggest there'd never been a great playwright, famous or otherwise. But I'm telling you, once these seekers started to come, they didn't stop. And they kept asking, wanting, demanding. Now, what was this little town to do? The house that Shakespeare had bought to spend his final years in, known as New Place, had been completely remodeled. Shakespeare himself wouldn't have recognized it. As for where the great man was born, many years would pass before the famous house on Henley Street would be selected from the surviving buildings of the town. Shakespeare's probable birthplace, known as Brook House, had already been demolished. What was this little town to do? Visitors couldn't be directed to Shakespeare's monument bust in the church. It hadn't yet been radically altered as it would be in 1748 and 49 to show a writer holding a quill. The bust was still in its original form, showing what looked like a businessman sitting on a sack of grain. What was this little town to do? There was money to be made from these arriving Shakespeare admirers, but unless something was found or invented soon, word would spread that Stratford was a bore, and nothing remained of their once great writer. In this hour of need, along came what Mark Twain calls the greatest of inventors, accident. There happened to be, behind Shakespeare's former house of New Place, a beautiful old mulberry tree. The tree looked to be well over 100 years old. Hey, it must have been planted around the time Shakespeare lived in the house. Why not tell these seekers of all things Shakespearean that the tree was hand-planted by none other than the great man himself, and that this mulberry was, quote, the last memorial of immortal Shakespeare, unquote. Okay, it was admittedly a long shot, but it was the town's only hope of saving face and creating a lucrative travel destination. Relieved to have finally thought of something, no matter how ludicrous, everyone in the town started spreading the word. Now every visitor was pointed to the tree. It worked! Oh, the tree was so magnificent that only a genius writer could have planted it. The mulberry quickly became regarded as the most valuable asset in the town. Even the greatest Shakespearean actor of his day, David Garrick, came up from London to see what the great man had planted. Finally, Stratfordians had something satisfying to proudly show their guests. For a while. Unfortunately, the owner of Shakespeare's former home of New Place and of the mulberry tree was a reverend by the name of Francis Gastrell. Now, it's likely this reverend detested theater and certainly Shakespeare's lascivious plays. However, he was initially tolerant of the souvenir hunters. But as time went on, the arrivals at his door swelled and swelled. Many, so many wanted a piece of the tree and thereby a piece of Shakespeare. Twigs, leaves, branches were broken off. His lawn and garden damaged. The reverend started trying to chase off the unwanted intruders, but still they came. Finally, the incessant traffic was too much for him. One night, without warning to the town, the good reverend went out back and chopped down the tree. The next day, the citizens of Stratford were seized with grief and astonishment when they learned of the sacrilegious deed. And nothing less but the destruction of the offender would satisfy them. The town rioted, shattering all the windows in Shakespeare's former house. Apparently to the angry crowd, Shakespeare's former house didn't possess any of Shakespeare's spirit. Only the blessed mulberry tree did. The reverend was forced to flee the town to save himself from the rage of the Stratfordians. The story should have ended there. And with it, Stratford's budding tourist industry, and even the myth of William Shakespeare himself. But an enterprising businessman, carpenter, and clockmaker by the name of Thomas Sharp acquired the fallen tree and started carving wood Shakespeare mementos to sell out of his store, which he renamed the Mulberry Shop. The initial purpose of the mulberry fantasy was restored. Visitors could no longer admire the tree or steal twigs and leaves from its branches, but they could now buy authentic Shakespeare mulberry carvings. An astonishing number of items were carved from the tree. Cups, goblets, bowls, ladles, even knives and forks. Then came tobacco cases, toothpick cases, pen cases, needle cases, comb cases, followed by cribbage boards, inkstands, nutmeg graters, tea caddies. So numerous were the items, it's highly unlikely that all of them could have come from a single tree. But each and every one of them was sold with a guarantee it was made from the one true wood. In London, well-authenticated blocks of the celebrated mulberry tree of Stratford began to be sold at auction. This tree possessed incredible powers of self-multiplication. Large tables, even dollhouse-sized replicas of Westminster Abbey were on sale. Back in Stratford, other trees began to disappear. The town's walnut trees were cut down, and not long after, authentic Shakespeare walnut carvings were on sale. Shakespeare was no longer an actor, a theater manager, or even a supposed poet and playwright. Shakespeare had become divine, and Stratford upon Avon was his shrine. In this atmosphere, once Stratford had become a literary sanctuary, the first incipient questions about authorship were raised. Researchers began to find holes in what was now accepted dogma, that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. There were, in fact, nothing but holes. But who would listen? Certainly not those that had bought authentic Shakespeare mulberry carvings. Certainly not the town of Stratford itself, which is benefiting mightily from the increased tourist trade. And certainly not the English-speaking world of academia that had a literary icon for the ages. And ever since, anyone who's even suggested the heresy that the man from Stratford did not write the works of Shakespeare has been called a crackpot. Yes, indeed. I am a Shakespeare crackpot. It's a very strange thing to be. There's not many of us. For to question Shakespeare's authorship is to question a certain fact, like gravity, or the sun, or even the great globe itself. Allow me to tell you how I became a Shakespeare crackpot. A few years after graduating with my PhD in theater, I was looking around for something new to write. I'd become a monologuist, and this would be my third monologue. And I remembered a crackpot idea called the Shakespeare Authorship Question, the theory that Shakespeare did not write his famous plays and poems. Now, I didn't know much about it other than it existed. I certainly never had a professor mention it other than to laugh at it and say it was a conspiracy theory from the lunatic fringe. I said, hey, that could make a funny play. Create some buffoon character who believes the nonsense that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare. So I started looking around for information on the subject. I didn't know if I could find it. I didn't even know if anyone still believed it. But once I started looking, I discovered there's actually thousands of books on the subject. Thousands! That was a surprise. Not one of these books that ever appeared on any professor's reading list. I'd never so much as opened one. So I did. I opened one. And I read for the very first time, there are no surviving plays, poems, diaries, or even any letters in William Shakespeare's own hand. What? I never heard this before. Wait, how could I have a PhD in theater and not have heard this? Why wasn't I told this? You know, there's over 900,000 words in Shakespeare's plays and poems, and every last one of those words in the original handwritten form is lost. Isn't that an interesting piece of trivia? Isn't that something you would tell a theater student? For example, I know lots of theater trivia. The ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus was killed when an eagle dropped a turtle on his bald head. How come I know this fact about Aeschylus and not this other fact about Shakespeare? And why wasn't I told this? And what about his letters? This was the fact that surprised me and changed me forever. No correspondence in William Shakespeare's own hand. I'd studied Shakespeare, at least I thought I had. I knew he divided his time between his home and family and business dealings in Stratford and his theater work in London. So I always assumed, as a famous author, he'd written dozens of letters, maybe hundreds. And of course, as a famous author, everyone would have kept his letters, or someone would have. Or someone would have referred to getting a letter in a diary. Hey, today I got a letter from Shakespeare. But no one could even find that. Years after finishing my theater studies, I learned on my own for the first time there's actually no contemporaneous paper trail connecting William Shakespeare with his works. Why wasn't I told this? But then I learned that researchers in Stratford had found Shakespeare's last will and testament. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. We're going to find out what happened to all his writings. No. Shakespeare's long and detailed will goes on for 3 pages, over 1,300 words, mentions all sorts of things like swords and silver gilt bowls and second-best beds, but never once mentions he was a writer. Never mentions a book, a play, a poem, an unfinished literary work, not a scrap manuscript of any kind. This is William Shakespeare's will. Now, how did I get a PhD in theater and not hear this? And why wasn't I told this? But then I learned there was an actual text manuscript in William Shakespeare's own hand. Not a play he had written, a play written by someone else that he had helped rewrite. This is the famous Sir Thomas More script, and Hand D, or the fourth writer, is believed to be William Shakespeare, and if so, this is the only text manuscript in William Shakespeare's own hand. And this is where there's a fascinating Canadian connection. Now, this theory that the only text manuscript of William Shakespeare is this Hand D in the Sir Thomas More script goes back to the 19th century. And in the year 1960, the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Canada, was doing some lectures, and they had a brilliant idea. They said, hey, why don't we confirm once and for all that William Shakespeare did write this Hand D? They knew of it. And they had a really interesting way of doing that. They went to the National Police Force of Canada in Ottawa, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the famous Mounties, and they asked, do you have a handwriting expert? They said, do we ever? We have the handwriting expert, Commissioner Roy A. Huber, of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He wrote the book on handwriting analysis. As a matter of fact, the book is still available on Amazon to this day. It's called Handwriting Identification, Facts and Fundamentals by Roy A. Huber. So they went to this Roy Huber and they said, look, we have a copy of the Hand D, it's 3 pages or so, and we have the signatures. There were 3 signatures on the will, as you know, and there are 3 other signatures in documents, the 6 signatures. And they said, could you confirm that this is William Shakespeare's handwriting? Come to Stratford and give a speech. It's a wonderful idea. It's not every day a Mountie gets invited to Stratford. He said yes. He didn't know what he was taking on. It turned out, as you know, the writing back then is very different from ours. It's called secretary hand. But Roy A. Huber spent 3 months studying this, made a full analysis, and became an expert at reading this type of writing. Comes to Stratford. They're all sitting there, much like today, waiting for him to confirm once and for all that this is indeed Shakespeare's handwriting. And he announces, quote, a positive identification of Shakespeare as Hand D is not possible, unquote. Shock goes through the room. What do you mean? The last thing they wanted to do is open up a can of worms. We're Canada. We don't do these things. But he's got charts. He's got a whole lecture, and he goes through it. He shows them. All of the I's are dotted in the signatures. None of the I's are dotted in Hand D, and he goes through letters. The K in Shakespeare's a completely different K in the Hand D. He said, there's only 2 possibilities. One, Hand D was written by someone else, or William Shakespeare completely changed his handwriting between the signatures and Hand D. Otherwise, there's no way to make the connection. Well, that was the end of Hand D. Only it wasn't. A very strange thing happened. Nothing. Nothing. It was completely, totally ignored. And to this day, the prestigious British Library here in London, the prestigious British Museum here in London, confirm not that this might be the only text manuscript of William Shakespeare, that this is in fact the only text manuscript. Even though the handwriting expert of a major national police force says the connection can't be made. Well, this is Shroud of Turin stuff. Do you remember the story of the Shroud of Turin? Fascinating story. The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was crucified, taken down from the cross, put in this shroud. And when God resurrected Jesus, an image of Jesus Christ appeared on the shroud. You've all seen this on the internet or on TV. The only problem is that in the 20th century, something called carbon dating was discovered. And in a one-time only deal, the Vatican said, we're going to allow scientists to test this. The scientists cut off a piece of the shroud, cut it in 3, sent it to 3 different labs, and all 3 labs came back with the same carbon dating finding, that the shroud wasn't from Jesus' time. The shroud was fabricated in the 13th or 14th century. Which is not surprising, because the first time there's any mention of the shroud in history is the 13th or 14th century. Well, this is exactly the same thing that had happened with Hand D. Exactly the same thing. Well, that's when I realized why none of the Shakespeare authorship questions had ever been mentioned to me in all my studies, leading to a PhD in theater. Because Shakespeare's not factual. Shakespeare's not historical. Shakespeare is, in fact, a religion. And it cannot be questioned. And that's why none of these questions appeared. So, the will. We will look at Shakespeare's will. Then I read the last time I did it, it worked. Then I read there were all these giants in history who I'd never been taught about, who had questioned Shakespeare. I'd never heard of any of them, or heard that they'd questioned. Sigmund Freud, founder of psychoanalysis, said Shakespeare never was a writer. I never heard that in all my studies. Walt Whitman, the poet, said Shakespeare never was a writer. Henry James, the 19th century essayist and novelist, he said, quote, "I'm haunted by the conviction that the Divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced," unquote. There's that Divine William. Religion again. Mark Twain. The Mark Twain. Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer. Studied Shakespeare's biography, actually traveled to Stratford upon Avon to investigate, and decided it was all hogwash. Mark Twain even wrote a book about it. Here's a copy of it. 1909, Is Shakespeare Dead? I'd never heard of this book. No professor had ever mentioned it. It certainly never appeared on any professor's reading list. Then I read that most editors leave Is Shakespeare Dead off Mark Twain's list of books. They don't like what the book says, so the book never happened. In our modern civilized world, we no longer burn books. We just leave them off lists. Now, all of this, which I was learning for the first time, wasn't so much about Shakespeare. Obviously, someone or some group wrote the plays and poems, and thank God we have them. No, this was about education, or rather miseducation. I had a right to this information, and yet it had been kept from me. And all I'd ever learned from all of the professors in all of the schools was there was no Shakespeare authorship question. And all they gave me was orthodoxy. Yes, orthodoxy, from the Greek orthos, meaning true, and doxa, meaning belief. Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare is not factual, it's not historical, it's a belief. Perhaps it's true. Perhaps it's true, but the only way to find out is to examine the evidence. And this had never happened. Why? Why was Shakespeare this untouchable God who must never be questioned? Particularly when there were these giants like Mark Twain and Sigmund Freud who said there was a question. There are times in a man's life when he becomes so angry, so furious, so murderously enraged, there's only one thing that person can do, and that's write and perform a one-man show. This was one of those times. The play I was going to write about the buffoon who believed Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare, that didn't happen. Instead, I adapted Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead and debuted it at the 2002 Montreal Fringe Festival, and that is how I became a Shakespeare crackpot. Not only am I a crackpot, but according to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford upon Avon, England, I also have a psychological aberration. I'm an ignorant snob, a publicity hound, a parasitic leech, and that comes directly from Stanley Wells himself. I have a poor sense of logic, refuse to accept evidence, and am possibly, certifiably mad. Now, understandably, people in Shakespeare's hometown do not like individuals like me. Their entire tourist site, the second largest in England after London, with over 5 million visitors to the area each year, is based on the single supposition that the man who wrote Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet was born in their little town. And this little town, with the help of Shakespeare professors, has been incredibly successful in keeping all doubts about Shakespeare's authorship from the general public. For the average person, a Shakespeare doubter is to be ignored. He is, after all, more than anything else, a conspiracy theorist. And this blanket dismissal of all questions about Shakespeare's authorship is even spread to colleges and universities, which are duty-bound by their mission statements to give both sides of any argument to their students. But the argument that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare is considered so radical, so extreme, so crackpot, their mission statements do not apply. And do not take my word for it. Let me quote one of the foremost Shakespearean experts on the planet, Professor James Shapiro of Columbia University, a strict believer in the traditional tale of William Shakespeare. Listen to what he says. Quote, I personally believe that William Shakespeare wrote the plays and poems attributed to him. However, the Shakespeare authorship question remains taboo in academic circles and walled off from serious study, unquote. Taboo and walled off from study. I wasn't aware there were 400-year-old literary subjects that were taboo and walled off from study. It's not taboo to me. It's not walled off to me. And I must tell you, my experience performing Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead has been a wonderful ride. I've performed it at fringe festivals all across North America. The last time I performed it at the Orlando Fringe in Orlando, Florida, the Orlando Weekly wrote, one of the smartest, most thought-provoking shows at the Fringe. It's a little strange. A play about a subject that's taboo and walled off from study at virtually almost every university in the world is well received at fringe festivals. What's wrong with those people? My performance was filmed at the 2003 Winnipeg Fringe Festival. It aired nationally in Canada. And then a few years later, YouTube came out. I put it on YouTube, and it's been on YouTube ever since in various forms. Incredible thing, YouTube. Thousands of hits all over the world every year. Last year alone, my performance was viewed in 96 different countries. This brought me to the attention of people who believe the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare. They're called Oxfordians. And people believe Sir Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare. They're called. And people believe Christopher Marlowe wrote Shakespeare. They're called. And people believe John Florio wrote Shakespeare. They're called. They're called florists. These people and others contact me trying to convince me that their particular candidate is the only writer of Shakespeare's works. I'm not a believer in any of them. I just hold the radical extreme crackpot position that students should be allowed to hear what the Shakespeare authorship question is. And they don't. Instead, most students hear from their professors something like the following.
Is that your Professor Jack?
Absolutely. Sure is.
You're convincing.
I've been wearing this since actually it was my mother's. It was one of those roll up the sleeves woman things. Turns out, unroll the sleeves and you're a professor. I'm going to be a professor now. Trust us! We're the experts. Students, there is no Shakespeare authorship question. This is settled academic thought. The question can no longer be asked. We've answered it for you. And I must stress, there's not a single reputable Shakespeare scholar who even suggests there's any question about Shakespeare's authorship. Of course, should a Shakespeare scholar suggest there's any question about Shakespeare's authorship, he or she, by definition, would no longer be reputable. Here now is the story of William Shakespeare. Listen carefully, for it will never change. Even though the records are all lost, Shakespeare attended the Stratford Grammar School because we say he did. And he learned everything he would ever need to know to write his famous plays and poems at this school because we say he did, which quite frankly wasn't very much. The works only appear to have knowledge of multiple languages, Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, none of that's there. And the works only appear to have knowledge of multiple domains of learning, law, philosophy, classical literature, ancient and modern history, art, astronomy, mathematics, music, medicine, military and naval terminology, English, French, and Italian court life, falconry, none of that's there. And even if it is there, you have to understand, people back then, they had bigger brains than we do today. And they had bigger heads to put them in, and all that was necessary was a grammar school education. Or no education, really. It's just imagination. Shakespeare, he imagined information. It all just popped into his head. He wrote it all down, and he made it all magically disappear. Well, that's why there's not a single document from Shakespeare's lifetime connecting him to the works. His works, they were like spirits and melted into air, into thin air. In any event, you're not supposed to ever hear there's no documents from Shakespeare's lifetime connecting him to the works. Untrained minds like yours might give some importance to this pesky little fact. And you must never read any of the thousands of books which question what I and other Shakespeare scholars... Whoa, 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 whoa. Who put these books on my desk? They are not on my reading list. What's this? Oh, no. Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography by Diana Price. I haven't read this book, but I know what's in it. Diana Price did research. Taboo and walled off from study research, which you must never do. She found of the 25 best-known authors of the period, only Shakespeare left behind no evidence of a career as a professional writer, a totally unique deficiency. Diana Price says our case for Shakespeare is based on misreadings, mythologizing, even willful deception. How dare she? Anyway, Diana Price is not a scholar. She's a college dropout. She would have never done research like this if she had a PhD. We would have never allowed it. Do not read this book. Oh no, what's this? What's this? The Shakespeare Guide to Italy by Richard Rowe. I haven't read this book, but I know what's in it. Now, we scholars have said, well, forever, that Shakespeare never left England and got Italy all wrong. Of course, we had to say that'd be unthinkable for a commoner to travel back then, go to Italy, and travel through all the cities and write notes for his plays. He'd been arrested as a spy, or there'd be some record of it. So we simply said he never went there. Of course, we never went to Italy to check, because that would be research, which is taboo and walled off from study. But Richard Rowe, he wasn't a Shakespeare scholar. He was a real estate lawyer, and he apparently spent 20 years in Italy and found that Shakespeare actually got Italy pretty much dead right, which we never found. Do not read this book. Oh no, what's this? Someone's put a question mark on Shakespeare's face. I haven't read this book, but I know what's in it. Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Exposing an Industry in Denial. This book is by heretics, including Alexander Waugh. If you see him, run the other way. This is also by Dr. Earl Showerman. Forget that name. I never said it. You never heard it. Showerman's not a real doctor. He's one of those medical doctors. And Dr. Showerman is apparently astonished at Shakespeare's vast medical knowledge shown in his plays. Now look, we've had a devil of a time discounting Shakespeare's legal knowledge. As you know, we had to create a mythical career for Shakespeare as a legal clerk to justify all the legal references in Shakespeare. The last thing we need is for students to find out there's even more medical references, and some of them are from ancient Greek texts that weren't even translated at the time. Do not read this book. Mark Twain. Stay away from him, at least parts of him. You can read the parts of Mark Twain we say are okay. Do not read this. These books are full of mischief. They should not have been written. They should not be read, and they are most definitely not on my reading list. But what would happen if a professor, instead of telling his students what to think, was to allow his students to learn how to think? I might be able to answer that question. Professor Don Rubin of York University, who just retired this year incidentally, has been teaching a course called Shakespeare, the Authorship Question. York University is one of the few universities in the entire world that actually touches on this subject, let alone teaches an actual course on it. Now, how did the course work? It was open to fourth-year students that filled up quickly with a waiting list. On the first day of class, the students were divided into small groups, and each of the groups was assigned one of the many candidates who may have written the works of Shakespeare, including the traditional William Shakespeare of Stratford. Each of the groups would have to make a presentation for the class explaining why their assigned candidate wrote Shakespeare. It's an exercise in research and critical thinking. And on the last day of class, there's an open discussion, then a secret vote to see who the students think wrote Shakespeare. Now, I visited this class, I performed for them, I spoke to them. They loved studying the subject. They felt it opened up the period to them. How did the vote turn out for the class that I visited when they voted a few weeks later? Well, the traditional William Shakespeare, the man we're told by most professors is certain and beyond doubt wrote Shakespeare. When these students voted as to who wrote Shakespeare, William Shakespeare of Stratford came in 7th. 7th. After the group theory, the Earl of Oxford, Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, and some others. Now, William Shakespeare did come ahead of someone called Roger Manners, the Earl of Rutland. Not that that proves anything. It's still entirely possible that the Earl of Rutland wrote Shakespeare. But this course, which the students said in their evaluations they all loved and felt opened up the period to them, came under tremendous attack. The media was outraged. How could a major university teach a course on the Shakespeare authorship question when there was no question? The other professors at York were all equally outraged. They wanted it stopped. As a matter of fact, the only reason they couldn't get it stopped is because Professor Rubin was facing retirement, and he was the most senior professor there. And now he's retired. It's highly unlikely that York will ever teach a course on this again. Students cannot be allowed to study the Shakespeare authorship question, because when they do, the vast majority will come to the same crackpot position that Mark Twain did, that the traditional story of William Shakespeare of Stratford as the author of Shakespeare's works never happened. We all suffer from the prejudice that professors, academics, educators are the experts. Now, they say it's certain and beyond doubt that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. They must know. They are, after all, the authorities. But Albert Einstein said blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. And Einstein also said, the only thing that gets in the way of my learning is my education. Thank you very much.